Hey, Circle Youth, welcome back, guys. I'm so glad that you're with us in person or online. Before we jump into the message this week, I just want to remind you of some incredible opportunities that are available for you. We have summer jobs that we want you to apply for. Seriously, do it. Come be part of an awesome staff team for a summer, get paid, and have fun doing exciting and challenging things. To learn more about some of these positions that we have open, just head to this website, cdac.ca/summerjobs, and make sure you apply. If you're 15 years old as of June, you can apply. So don't wait. Maybe even get to it after youth tonight. But hey, today is week 2 of Waitlisted, where we're talking about, well, waiting and waiting and waiting. So let's take a look at what must have been the longest game of Jenga ever played. Now, don't worry, we're not going to watch the entire thing. Take a look. The game was meant to showcase the abilities of the cap machines, and it went on for 28 hours. Now, by the end, there were 13 layers of blocks, and it was over 20 feet high. So I've got a question for you. What's the longest game that you've ever played? Now, I'm guessing you've never played a 28-hour game of Jenga, but what's the longest game that you've ever played? How long did it last? Now, maybe you might share about your longest running board game, a sports game, or other competitions. So just take a couple of minutes with your group and share. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm going to invest that much time into a game, I better win at the end. To spend so much time on something and then have it end in disappointment is, well, pretty disappointing. Now, what about you? Have you ever been disappointed by something you spent a long time waiting for? And what was it? Now, disappointment happens. I'm sure we've all felt it. Sometimes we invest a ton of time anticipating an upcoming experience or gift or a win, but then things don't go the way we hope they go. Sometimes the struggle is really real. Now, maybe you know what it's like for life to surprise you with a big loss, a turn of events, or a disappointment. And when those surprises hit, we're often left waiting and wondering, why did this happen? How long will I feel this way? How do I fix it? Can anyone help me? Or maybe even, where's God? Now, today I want to talk about how to survive some of these times of disappointment and crisis, and where God is when we're waiting for things to turn around. Now, disappointment or crisis is often followed by a time of waiting. So you might be waiting to feel better, to get a second chance, to see if your situation will improve, or maybe you're waiting to see if God will help you. And while you're waiting, well, you might wonder, can God really be trusted? Does God actually care? Can God even see me? If God really loves me, why am I still waiting? Now, if you can relate to any of this, you're not alone. So let me introduce you to someone from Scripture who knows a lot about surviving major moments of crisis and disappointment. Now, if you're familiar with the Bible, there's a good chance you've heard of the Apostle Paul. Now, Paul did not follow the teachings of Jesus. In fact, he believed the followers of Jesus were enemies of God. Now, this belief drove Paul to defend his faith by imprisoning and even killing Christians. But then, something significant happened in Paul's life. He had a personal encounter with God, and he surrendered his life to Jesus. Now, when Paul met Jesus, he couldn't have predicted what God had in store for him. Paul eventually became one of the greatest Christian influencers of all time. He wrote much of the New Testament of the Bible. He was a significant leader of the early church and was responsible for bringing the message of Jesus into new parts of the world. So he's a pretty important guy. Now, despite everything God had in store for Paul, Paul's life after turning toward Jesus held pretty difficult moments too, including some big crises and a lot of waiting. Now, one of the major ways Paul was often waitlisted during his life was being sent to prison. Now, after spending so much time and effort throwing followers of Jesus into prison, that's exactly where Paul ended up. It's kind of ironic. Paul spent about 5 years of his life in prisons for spreading the message of Jesus. And while he was there, I wonder if he ever thought, God, how am I supposed to, fulfill your plans for my life if I keep getting thrown into jail? Every time things start going well, I end up behind bars. What are you doing? Why aren't you stopping this? Hello, God? Now, we can read about one of these occasions in the book of Acts. Acts is a book in the Bible that recounts how the good news of Jesus spread around the world, how the early church began to grow, and what happened to some of the key church leaders of the time, like Paul. Now, Acts chapter 16 tells us about one of Paul's journeys to Macedonia and what happened to him there along with his friend Silas. Now, after a long journey where God finally leads Paul and his crew to Macedonia, they faced a major crisis. You see, Paul and Silas were beaten and they were thrown into jail for preaching the message of Jesus. And this chapter tells us that God clearly led Paul and his friends to Macedonia to share the gospel. So if God led them there, why did they end up in prison? Did they make a mistake? Did God make a mistake? Did God put them in prison on purpose? Now, while Scripture doesn't tell us why God allowed Paul and Silas to be thrown into prison, it does make it clear that God didn't want them to stay there. Paul and Silas were interrupted by disappointment and crisis, yes, and they were waiting for God's rescue, and they got it. They did, but in the meantime, they still found a reason to worship, even while they waited and wondered what would happen next. And as they sang, God showed up, and he showed up in a miraculous way. God rescued Paul and Silas from prison with an earthquake that brought down the prison walls, and they could have escaped, but they chose to remain in their jail cell. The jailer saw this, and he was so moved by what he'd seen. And Paul told the jailer and his family, saying, "Look, put your trust in Jesus." And that day, the jailer and his entire family were baptized after hearing the message of Jesus. That's amazing. That even when they were waiting for God's rescue, Paul and Silas, they trusted that God hadn't abandoned them. While they waited, they worshiped. And after they were rescued, they got right back to work. God was faithful to Paul and Silas while they waited in prison. And while we're waiting, God is faithful to us too. You know, that word faithful means to be loyal, to be constant, to be steadfast and never failing. That's who Paul and Silas knew God to be. So who's God to us? And who's God to you? I don't know what disappointments or crises you're facing right now or that you'll face in the coming months or years, but when you find yourself waiting for God to rescue you, I hope that you remember what we talked about today. While you're waiting, God is faithful to you. God is faithful to you, even when you're not faithful to God, even when you're losing hope, even when you're filled with questions and doubts about him, even when you're tired of waiting. So when you're waiting for God's rescue, here's what I hope you'll do. Trust that God is with you, like God was with Paul and Silas. God was faithful to Paul and Silas. And while we're waiting, God is faithful to us too.